Next speaker is Dr. Brandon Hopkins, I believe, and because he came back, so it must be him. And let me go down to his title so I get it semi-right. Indoor Queen Banking to Improve Supply and Better Meet Demand. Dr. Brandon Hopkins. Take it away, Brandon.
Right. Thanks, Steve. I'll try to take it away. Okay. Is that working? Can you see my slide here?
Brandon, we can see your presenter view and your slide. So actually, we're looking at your presenter view.
Oh, that's weird. I don't know how to fix that. Does that change anything?
It was changed, and now you've changed it back. So
well,
what
we
you
can see kind of your whole monitor thing there.
Okay.
There, that might be better. Oh, yeah.
Is that good enough?
Oh, because you're using Keynote?
Yeah. Does that work?
Yeah, at least we don't see the next slide in a size.
Okay.
Yeah, we can see the left hand, the small thumbnails, and we can see the right hand slide layout also.
Does that work? Does that work okay?
Sure.
I don't know how to change that presenter view thing.
Okay.
Maybe. Uh-oh. Making things worse, probably. Did that fix it?
Yes, very nice.
Okay. All right. My IT skills are really shining. Okay, yeah, so thanks, Steve. I'm going to talk about this summer indoor storage, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the use of indoor storage in general at times other than winter. So some folks might be familiar with the concept of storing bees indoors for the winter. Really put to heavy use in Canada. This is a photograph from a book published in 1926. I mean, they've been doing it for a century or more, storing bees indoors to protect the bees from the harsh winters in Canada and a few other countries, cold weather. And so in the US, more recently, but it's not, you know, they've been doing it in places like Montana and Wyoming for a long time, in like earthen cellars and things like that, and in the Midwest. And more recently, it's really taken on really a new level, a new scale here in the US. So this building, this video here is a building designed and built entirely for storing bees indoors for the winter months. So here they're just setting off a smoke bomb in the building, and that white wall kind of on the right with the slits cut in it is an air plenum, so air blows down that hallway, and then those slits are holes where air can come out, and those are specifically designed to blow air down the between the rows of stacked colonies and pallets. And so this building is designed to hold about 40,000 colonies. And in this location in Twin Falls, there's two of these buildings built right side by side. So it's really quite a large scale. And so some of the work that we've been doing, and I'm just kind of highlighting this use is the main use of these buildings, but we're kind of finding that there's a lot of potential for the use of these facilities at times other than the winter months. And so since it's kind of coming to the end of the summer, I thought I'd talk a little bit about that use in the summer months. And so as far as mite control, what this really is aimed at is taking advantage of the fact that mite control options are far more effective when there's little to no brood. And so there's a number of times when colonies are broodless, and what this is kind of removing that protective barrier of capped brood that can shelter mites from the effects of the miticide. And so, let's see here, these animations, okay. So there are a number of mite control options, and it seemed like when I first started doing bee research, a lot of the beekeepers' complaints was that we don't have enough effective controls, chemical options for mite control. And I think, I guess my argument would be that there are, quite a few effective mite control options. But really all of them are designed, or the way that you use them in the practice is designed to really either a long-lasting strip to be there to provide the chemical in the hive for a period that covers a full reproductive brood cycle for those colonies, or you apply multiple treatments like with oxalic acid, the dribble every week to span, the 21 days or 30 days to cover the emerging brood as new mites come out of that capped brood. Or like the apivar strips, you have this slow release of the chemical. And so what our work is really based off of is this practice of caging queens. So it's somewhat of a common practice now in countries in Europe and becoming more popular here in the US. But the idea is that it's often done when honey supers are being pulled. The beekeeper goes and finds the queen, cages the queen so that she can't continue laying for a period of time that causes the colony to have no capped brood. And then they release the queen and apply a treatment. And so this figure here shows that the use of this thymol treatment in conjunction with queen caging is far more effective than the thymol treatment alone. And I think maybe even more importantly is these error bars here. It's not only really more effective, but you get a more consistent treatment. And so you have something that's more reliable. And I think that's equally important, especially for commercial beekeepers, to have something they can depend on. And so what that figure shows there is basically with queen caging, that thymol treatment's 97% effective, and without the queen caging, it's only 76% effective. And they've done this same sort of work with oxalic acid and queen caging. And so, in this study, it's a single dose of oxalic acid. So that's why oxalic acid alone there in the blue is appears to be so ineffective. And so that's what a single application would do while there's brood. And the queen caging alone, just a brood break alone, is more effective than a single dose of oxalic acid. And so what we were motivated to do was base work with indoor storage, where we find these colonies coming out of the storage period with no brood, was to do a modified version of this queen caging that is really totally impractical on a commercial scale. But because there are these purpose-built buildings now, a lot of times owned by beekeepers, so they have access to put their bees in large quantities into these buildings and control the temperature and the light that those bees are exposed to. So the concept was, could you put bees into a cold, dark space for a period of time and sort of halt brood rearing in order to improve Varroa control options. And so we were fortunate to get funding to purchase these refrigerated cargo containers. These are 20-foot refrigerated cargo containers, as Laura likes to call them, reefers. And so these provide us an opportunity to control the temperature and to a degree the metabolic gases and the light that the bees are exposed to. And so the first trial here that we did was to do this in the fall. And so I think there's a number of opportunities, and it's certainly regionally specific and specific to different beekeepers' operations. But there's generally, for most beekeepers, a few periods of time throughout the year when they have 3 weeks when the bees are either not in pollination or not, actively making honey. And so for us here in Washington, that is often in August. And for this commercial beekeeper, they are entirely done with seed pollination, which is sort of their last pollination contract. And after that, there's really not much of a honey flow. And so from August until about this time of year in October, the bees really are costly as far as labor and input. So the bees need feeding, and they need to be fixed up, and they're robbing each other, and they're spreading disease. And so our first attempt was the beginning of August with this commercial beekeeper. And so in this work, we took commercial colonies and put some of the colonies indoors, and then the other set of colonies remained outdoors and received sort of the normal treatment options for that commercial beekeeper. And then we reset, so those colonies went in August. They went into the cold storage period for 18 days. The control group remained outdoors. And so after 18 days, and I think this part is critical, especially if this is something a beekeeper would pursue as a management style, is that this beekeeper had access to really great fall forage that not everybody has access to. So this beekeeper was able to move some of these bees into buckwheat after this storage period. And there was also some mustard that's grown here for soil fumigation in potato fields. So after those 18 days, the colonies were basically entirely broodless. They received a single treatment and then were sent out to the buckwheat and mustard fields and fed sugar syrup to try to get them to brood back up and prepare, the colonies for winter, so they could produce those winter bees and get the weight back up. And so these are the results. So these numbers here represent an alcohol wash in October. So the colonies that were indoors were well below threshold, and you can see these error bars highly consistent in their mite numbers compared to the group that remained outdoors and received a single treatment of miticide. The mite levels were all over the place and well above threshold for October. So it proved to be very effective in that case. After that fall treatment, we had beekeepers that were really interested in doing this in the spring. And this was something that I hadn't really even considered. I assumed that beekeepers were too busy making their splits and they were going into tree fruit pollination. But there are some outfits that either don't do tree fruit pollination or have a period of about 3 weeks between the time they leave almonds and their next pollination contract. So in this case, the mite control was still more effective with the indoor, and it was the same situation where the colonies went indoors for 18 days, and this was in April after pollination in almonds. But this was in Idaho. So in that time of year in Idaho, there's not a lot of forage. There might be a little bit of dandelion starting to bloom, but the colonies that sat outside continued to produce brood and continued to grow and received a single mite treatment. So the main concern in that spring brood break was the concern of whether the hives would be able to, would they still produce honey, would they still make weight? And we found 55 days after the indoor group was, let's just say, equal weight to the outdoor group. And it's likely just because there wasn't a lot of forage, the temperatures are still cool in Idaho that time of year. And so the going indoors for 18 days really had no effect on the weight gain for those colonies over time. So again, this was really motivated by the beekeepers and something that we really didn't intend to look at, but I think is really pretty smart as far as management style goes. And so these beekeepers, this is a different set of beekeepers in Idaho, were interested in using this indoor brood break period as a form of management of colony growth more than they were for mite control. So this beekeeper, coming out of almonds with their testing protocols, found that they really had no serious mite issues that time of year, or at least in that year. And so they wanted to see if they could use this brood break period to slow down swarming effects, basically. So some of these operations have so many colonies that it's difficult for them to get through splitting, feeding, moving colonies before they start losing hives in the trees, let's say, to swarming. So in this case, by looking at the brood development, we have the blue bars, which is just the brood of these two treatment groups before this indoor storage period. And they're basically the same amount of brood area. And the orange bars are the brood area after this 18-day storage period. And for the outdoor group, it's just 18 days after the indoor group went in. So the outdoor group continued to brood up. It's springtime, everything's great. They've got all this almond pollen packed away, and they're growing wonderfully. So you can see here that in the spring period, I think because it's quite a shock, they still have some brood after 18 days. So they're not completely broodless. I think it's a major switch to go from the spring build up, almost basically ready to swarm, to being put in the cold and the dark. But it did drastically reduce brood rearing. And this beekeeper wanted to take, this beekeeper wanted to take a set of colonies out at 12 days, another set out at 14, and another set out at 18 days. And then we followed those colonies for the next 2 months and monitored the colonies for swarming activity. So in the set that came out at 12 days, we found 45% of those colonies were drawing out swarm cells and preparing for swarming. In the group that was in for 14 days, about a third of them were attempting to swarm. And the group that was in for the full 18 days, in the period that we observed them, never drew out any swarm cells. So it was quite effective at controlling that swarming behavior. And that was the goal of this commercial beekeeper. So this is the new stuff I really wanted to talk about today, because we're just wrapping up this experiment for the summer indoor queen banking. And I don't have a lot of the results to share. I've got a little bit as it's coming in. And we still have some follow-up to do on the banked queens that are now installed in colonies in California. But so this idea is to bank queens, right? To store a large number of queens in colonies, to hold the queens in order to provide them to beekeepers at times when the demand might be high and the supply is low. So this graph here is completely made up just to demonstrate sort of some of these differences in the season. So this red line is this made up supply of queens, where and the gray line is the made up demand curve, I guess. And so just assuming, say, beekeeping starts in January or February with almonds, the supply is fairly low. I mean, there are some, you can get some queens and nukes and things out of maybe the southeast, and a lot of queens are starting to come in out of Hawaii, but it's hard to kind of be on those lists. And there's certainly lots of beekeepers that would love to get queens earlier, if only there were enough queens to provide at that time of year. And so originally this idea was, and we are starting that project this month, is the banking queens indoors for the winter. But we had a collaborator who was more interested in this period, highlighted in this blue section here. And that's this idea of summer queen banking. And so these queen producers are ramping up to meet demand. So in April and May and June, they have thousands, tens of thousands of nucleus colonies in the field producing queens. And you can't really turn that off like a switch. But as beekeepers are finished making their splits and they've got the number of hives they need and they start stacking up honey supers, the demand for queens falls off quite a bit. But now you're left with all the nukes that queen producers have in the field, and they have a large number of queens that they have to hold on to until demand picks back up, say in August, September, as beekeepers pull honey and get colonies fixed up for winter. And so this is the period of time that we were kind of targeting for queen banking is this June, July, August time period when there are a lot of queens available, but demand might be a little low. Yeah, and so we'll skip that for now. So this work was really inspired by a group, Andre Rouse's lab in Canada. And so they did some work with queen banking during the winter period. And so what they found, and because what they found, you know, that was very interesting to me is that they had a much higher survival with a cold storage temperature of 15 degrees Celsius, which is really very high for indoor wintering of colonies normally. So this 4 degrees Celsius on this blue bar is a sort of standard indoor colony storage temperature for the winter. And so 15 degrees is quite a bit warmer, but they had significantly higher survival of these queens, and 86% survival from November to April is outstanding. I mean, it's very amazing and would be exciting to, I think, any queen producer. And so this work and that temperature finding is what we based our summer banking storage work from. There we go. Okay, so, and it's a little bit different idea. I mean, why bank them indoors in the summer? Can't you just have all the banks outside? And so our collaborators' reason for wanting to pursue this indoor summer banking is that it can be very, very hot during that period that we're targeting here in June, July, and August. And so in Northern California, where a lot of these commercial queens are produced, the average high temperature is 98 degrees, and it can be 100+ degrees for weeks on end at this time of year, which can be very difficult on colonies, especially when they have hundreds of queens to feed and maintain in each bank. And so that on top of the fire dangers in Northern California, and things don't seem to be much better, the idea of banking thousands of queens, potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of investment in a very hot, dry, somewhat fire prone area is a concern for some of the folks in the industry. So what we did was we set up this experiment to compare the queens from, let's see, go back here. So I'll start at the beginning. So what we did was we used 2,150 queens, which I'll tell you is a really scary number to be in control of, with a high value sort of experiment. So half of those queens were banked with the commercial queen producer in Northern California, and half of those queens were banked indoors at 15 degrees Celsius in those refrigerated cargo containers. We also wanted to look at the stocking rate for those banks. So in each of those locations, the outdoor and the indoor group, we had replicates of 3 and 3 different stocking rates. So we had banks with 50 queens each, banks with 100 queens each, and banks with 200 queens in each bank. At the onset of the experiment, we also took 50 queens and installed them in single deep boxes as an unbanked control that we could then sample later. So 30 queens from the initial pool before banking was sent to Dr. Tarpey's lab for analysis. And then at the end of this experiment, after 8 weeks of storage, we caught 10 of the unbanked controls and sent to the lab. And so all this in red is then sent to the lab for analysis of the queen quality. They're sacrificed for that. And so there's 10 queens from each bank. That's what this is, 30 here, all sent to Tarpey's lab. So a large number of queens sacrificed for queen quality. And then the part that we still have yet to do, and this just occurred in the last couple of weeks, is that we have 5 queens from each bank. Actually, a lot more than that, but that's what we're going to look at. So all of these surviving queens were installed into colonies in Southern California a few weeks ago. And so we'll go look at least 5 queens from each bank and assess the brood quality, the queen quality of those queens that have been banked. This is just some of the real quick preliminary stuff. The raw data hasn't really been processed yet. But what this is here is this is the grade that you get back from the honeybee queen and disease clinic from Tarpey's lab. So this figure on the left is B plus, this overall assessment. That's from the 30 queens that were sent from the initial pool. And the queen quality report, this overall assessment of an A minus is the overall assessment from the queens that were banked. So that's this number of queens is 160. And so this hasn't been broken out into each of those different stocking rates. This doesn't yet compare the indoor storage versus outdoor. But I threw this in here because it's what I had, and because it does show, that it wasn't overly harmful. Certainly not for the insemination quality. So that banking period, either indoors or outdoors, didn't affect, the total sperm numbers or sperm viability or anything like that. And I think the C plus for the morphometrics isn't that surprising, and it's almost probably entirely due to the weight. And so I think it's well known that while queens are banked, their ovaries aren't as big, and they're smaller when they're banked. And those queens most likely will plump back up, I'm sure, once they're installed in hives and start laying. So it'll be exciting to see how the queens did between the two different groups when we go through the data. This was just sent yesterday. I do want to thank the students who've been working on this project, Stephen and Anna, and they're working together for this summer banking, and then we have the similar setup for a winter banking experiment that'll start in October. And they're also assisted by these other wonderful graduate students in the lab, Connor, Emily, who I don't have a picture of yet, and Kelsey, and then the postdocs who've been fabulous, Kelly and Rachel, have also helped with a number of these projects. I do want to thank the folks that funded this work, Project APSM, in particular, Washington State Beekeepers Association, California State Beekeepers, the Almond Board, Washington Tree Fruit Research, and USDA NEFA. Hopefully I have some time for questions.
Yeah, Brandon, it looks like you have a good bit of time for questions.
Okay. All right, well, yeah, maybe I went a little fast.
So everyone sees Laura's explanation of the word reefer.
I can't. I don't know how to get back to these things, but
refrigerated containers, best name ever, she says.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So, do we have any questions for Brandon? Well, Brandon, have you gotten any reports back on the acceptance rate between the ones that were stored indoors or outdoors? Is there any difference in that?
Yeah, I don't think we'll know that for a while. They were just installing those queens last week, and so they probably haven't followed up yet as far as that. And we're going to go down there in November and actually take pictures of the brood and assess the brood patterns of those queens as some measure of queen quality in addition to the lab tests.
Okay.
I can tell you, I mean, it's not in here yet, but the survival of the queens between the outdoor and indoor are most likely not going to be, will probably be no significant difference. There might have been a few more survived in the indoor versus the outdoor, which I don't think is a big surprise. I mean, I certainly didn't want to lose a huge number of queens in the indoor group, but was perfectly satisfied with it being equal to what survived in the outdoor group. I mean, that's an outdoor group, banked with a queen breeder who's very good at their job, and had people, maintaining those banks consistently over the 8-week period. So I think if the indoor group matches that outdoor group as far as overall survival of the queens, it would be, quite a success if you look at the other factors, I mean, the cost that it takes to in labor and the drain on support colonies to maintain banks, if they're the same survival, it's probably much cheaper or safer to maintain those banks indoors, because the indoor banks didn't get new frames of brood every few days or every week. They weren't fed syrup continuously, that kind of stuff. So the indoor bank really had almost no labor involved once the banks were set up.
Okay. Hey, so Brandon, some questions have come in. One of them says, can we get the results of the brood quality after the hives are looked at? So I guess the question is, are you planning on looking at brood quality after when you look at the hives next? Which
for sure, yeah, that's the big thing. I mean, and that's why we wanted to install those hives, and so we have a collaborator in far southern California who installed the 2,000, well, it wasn't quite 2,000 then, but those thousands of queens, all with marked cages, so we know where they came from. And so we'll go and we're allowing them time, to lay, and so they've got a good solid capped brood pattern, and then we'll go in and we'll assess the laying pattern, the brood quality of those queens after banking.
Okay. There's another question from Mark. Brandon, I may have missed it. Are you going to send off a set of queens for analysis after they have been in the hive for a week or two? So I guess it's the question of, are they going to recover their, the weight, for example?
Yeah, that's a good question. We didn't plan for that, but that is a good question. I mean, I guess if we can talk the beekeeper out of the expensive queens that he purchased, the thousands of queens that he bought, maybe he'd give up a few we could sacrifice. I mean, I already feel bad for the 190 queens that we killed and sent off, but
okay.
I guess we didn't have to kill them, but
okay. I'm not sure I understand exactly the next question, but it says, for the hobby beekeeper, how long do you bank a queen before doing OAV? Do you bank her in the hive or in a nuke?
What's OAV?
Yeah, could someone explain that?
It might be oxalic acid vaporization, I guess.
Yes.
Okay.
Forgot all these Canadians. Yes, man. Yeah.
Yeah. So, that's a good question. So that's back to that, not the banking necessarily, maybe, but the queen caging. I think maybe it would be that question. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to get the last capped brood emerged before you do that. And so there are, and I think maybe even Randy has a calendar on his website for this, but you look at that. So assuming you have some drone brood in there, it's 24 days from the time that queen laid her last egg. So the day you caught that queen, you'd want to do it 24 days later. So it depends on whether you want to make one trip or two trips to the yard. You could go and release the queen at 17 days. I don't have it in front of me. Say 17 days, and then come back 7 days after that and do the vaporization. And you should have 7-day-old larva in the hive that's not yet capped, because you'd have mites crawling in at day 8. So you'd want to do it right then. It depends on how good you are at a calendar. And the other way to do is just to cage them for for 21 days, and then come back and treat and feed and do your work all in one trip. Hopefully that answers.
Okay. The next question: anyone thinking of banking mini nukes themselves?
Oh, like banking them as in like storing them, maybe? I mean, there are people that store, the winter nukes indoors. I don't know about the mini nukes. Maybe the question is about those like little bird box style nukes. I haven't heard of anyone trying that. I mean, I think there's certainly room for improvement on how queens are banked. We banked our queens in the wooden shipping cages. And there's probably better ways to bank queens if you're really going to hold them for a long time. We kind of kept it as simple as possible, but maybe those little mini nukes might be a better way to bank queens.
Okay.
Certainly, because at least the queens could remain on the comb and be cared for by their own bees.
So there's another question from Michael Morrison. Where can we get the results of the brood? Always been told that bank queens are not as good at laying.
Yeah, well, you could email me in like December or January, and I'll let you know. Yeah, if they had, might be something I'd talk about like at an ABF meeting or something like that if they are doing that, maybe. But yeah, I guess just contact me and I'll have that answer here in a few months. I bet we won't be able to tell the difference between the banked queens and the queens that were unbanked, right? So we have those unbanked controls, and that's somewhat based on the experience of these, so the commercial queen producer that provided the queens and banked them, they've banked queens in the summer before, just, not so many, and it's a bit of a pain point for them. And then they provide those queens to beekeepers in the fall. And they said that they feel like those queens are perfectly good. So I think that we'll find that these bank queens do perfectly well, would be my guess, but we'll see.
Okay. Hey, here's a good question. Oh, I guess you already just, this is from Connor. Hey, Connor. Allison showed sperm quality for cold shot queens is poor. Is indoor storage going to affect sperm quality or brood quality for queens?
That's a good question. I'd be happy to have Allison jump in here so people get a break from hearing my voice. But my guess is no. I mean, I think queens that come out of cold storage do perfectly well. As long as the colony is strong, they maintain a fairly level temperature inside those colonies in the winter. And so the queen is, not usually hanging out around the outside of that cluster getting cold. Certainly, if they maintain drones through the winter, they might be a little more susceptible, but I think the sperm quality and the spermatheca should be in good shape. But that'd be, if Allison has something, that'd be great.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add. I haven't looked at that specifically, but it's possible that Shelley Hoover may have. If anybody has, then Shelley would have. But I echo Brandon in that I wouldn't expect cold storage to actually mean that the queen herself gets cold. If the population is enough, then she should stay near the center of the cluster, hopefully, and be at a steady temperature. But I don't know exactly